Welcome, everyone, and a huge welcome and thanks to Judith Warner for coming, spending the lunch hour with me to talk about parenting middle schoolers. I'm so excited. Judith Warner is the New York Times bestselling author and journalist who wrote Perfect Madness and We've Got Issues, and her new book, And Then They Stopped Talking to Me, Making Sense of Middle School. You can see I have already gotten some good work out of it, some good pages. Thank you so much for being here, Judith, and
Thank
really looking forward to talking to you.
thank you for doing this, especially at such a busy and crazy time.
Oh
I
my
really,
goodness.
it's nice to have a break, isn't it?
I am an extrovert, so it really helps me to just be with people and to talk, even if it's through a computer screen.
And I'm an extreme introvert, so Zoom actually works really well for me for talking to people because it feels like it's very kind of up close and personal, but at the same time I can kind of hide a little bit, so it's good.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm glad we've met in the middle during the pandemic. So I just graduated from middle school, or I should say my children just graduated from middle school. So the memories are all very fresh for me of parenting during that age. And I was really interested in your book. You talk about middle school in our minds and how sometimes as parents we have this idea of what middle school is. Can you talk a little bit more about going into it, maybe for parents who have a fourth or fifth grader and they're sort of thinking ahead? How do we create this idea of middle school, and what are the ways that may be helpful or not so helpful?
I think that we have middle school in our minds individually based on our own experiences, and then we have middle school in our minds collectively, the way that we talk about it as a society. And the two, tend to dovetail, but they're not 100% the same thing. And I just know approaching middle school with my daughters, I didn't really think about the personal piece that I was bringing to it quite so much as what was sort of swirling all around, this expectation that it was going to be this moment when there would be all of this new danger, all this enormous like mean girl stuff. And of course, I mean, yes, that was the moment of meanness and suffering for me at the time, but it didn't have a label, right, of the mean girl moment, which of course makes it seem that much bigger. That it was a time when there was going to be like all this horrific online stuff and sexting and just all these different kinds of danger that were somehow going to be worse than anything we knew at the time when we were growing up. And it was, like all of these dangers, it was a little bit vague, it wasn't clear, but I just remember one friend who had an older son saying years before, I mean, as you mentioned, when you're a parent in the lower grades even saying, oh, you think it's bad now, just wait. So there was this anticipation of this horrible, dangerous, moment of great degradation. And then in addition, of course, there were the expectations that I brought with me that wasn't even necessarily so conscious of, which was the fear of the most, horrific kind of social suffering, which of course is a reality for many, many, if not most kids that age. But of course, remembering it from the perspective of an eighth grader and with the understanding, let's say, of an eighth grader, which is something completely different. And, both that sort of collective and individual expectation can be really limiting because it keeps us from seeing our kids in the present from who they are.
Yeah, no, I remember as a younger parent also having people, the old, parents of older kids, sort of that, oh, just you wait, you think this is hard now. And it's so not helpful. Like,
Yeah.
even if there are difficult stages, like telling us it's going to be worse, just helps you anticipate that awfulness. And it's funny, one of the things I think is so hard for us right now in the pandemic and with all of the turmoil and isolation that we're experiencing and the things going on in the country, is anticipating the election coming or anticipating winter. Right now I think we're all sort of like, oh, it's going to be terrible, we're going to be stuck indoors, there's going to be another flu season, and it compounds our misery, right? To
And it's the same thing in this case. And that the issue in terms of what we bring forward individually, the most important thing, the most important problem is that what we bring forward is based on our perceptions as 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And we think that those perceptions are the same that we would have today because they're remembered in a very rational way. They're remembered very, very strongly. And we have, the capacity for complex thinking at that time, a vocabulary that's not that different from ours now. And what we don't realize is that it's actually a very limited perspective. And when we bring that to what's going on with our kids, and especially with other people's kids, we do them a huge disservice because we're seeing them in a much more black and white, limited, and actually immature way than we would if we took a step back, educated ourselves a bit more, and learn to take a kind of bigger picture look at what's going on. The other thing is when all of this focus on danger hides the truth, right, which is that middle school today is a safer, cleaner, kind of in many ways more decent experience than it was, at least for those of us who grew up in the 70s and I would say the early 80s. The kinds of things that went on then are frankly worse. I mean, if you look at the statistics, but even in terms of, memory and the things we fear now about like mean stuff online, there was so much mean stuff going on. It was just going on in an analog form.
Right, right. And parents weren't as aware.
Right.
Parents weren't as involved in their kids' lives, so they didn't have this window into it.
Right.
And yeah, and I think even kids growing up in the 90s, I think the rates of like teen drug use and pregnancy and acting out has all declined since the
Absolutely.
90s as well.
The early 90s. I mean, the early 90s were sort of the peak, I think, for all of that. Now, of course, they started measuring more then too.
Right.
So but they definitely were going down. I mean, it's funny, they were going down in the period when hysteria was actually spiking, which was the late 90s and early 2000s, but they were really going down. And certainly for Gen Xers, I mean, Gen Xers can pretty much rest assured that the world that their, young teens or preteens are encountering now is safer and in many ways better
Yeah.
than it was. Including in the parenting. We talk all the time about, and certainly I write in the book a great deal about the dangers, what happens when parents go too far in getting too enmeshed in their kids' stuff, especially at that age. But on the other hand, at least we do have the desire to be emotionally present, to be paying attention, to make our kids feel heard and seen, which so many Gen Xers didn't. So, that is something that is potentially good too, so long as it doesn't go too far in an
Yeah.
over direction.
Yeah, no, I thought this, in the book, you really, I feel like you were so brave and vulnerable around your own sort of memories of yourself in middle school versus what you later discovered was sort of the reality. And I've had some of that. It's so funny when my kids started middle school, for whatever reason, I started reconnecting with my middle school friends. And I think part of it was this sense making of trying to say, are my recollections correct? And sort of realized I had this idea of myself, and you talk about that in the book, of sort of our own narrative of who we were in middle school and what we keep and what we neglect. So it sounds like parents going into middle school, their kids going into middle school should sort of drop the fear, right? And maybe what should we do about these sort of ideas of like what it's like, or any other sort of pieces of advice that are really concrete about like, do this, don't do that.
For me, and this is somewhat of a reflection of sort of how I interact with the world and what I do when I'm facing something difficult. And I found being a middle school parent really difficult. What was so great in working on this book is that I got to educate myself. I was able to access a whole new vocabulary and set of concepts for making sense of what was going on socially among the kids and also among the parents. But the most eye-opening thing really was, in a sense, becoming a grown-up in the way that I viewed what was happening. And it's so empowering to do that, when you're able to do that, because to be 11, 12, 13 is to be sort of an open wound when it comes to insecurity and it comes to, social insult. And it also means to really not understand other people, right? Not understand their behavior. So you do see yourself as a simple victim. But when you develop a more kind of grown-up mindset and understand the complexities of what's going on with everybody, it just leaves you in such a more secure place where you can be so much more helpful for your kids. So I would just say, I mean, whether it's my book or whether it's listening to other experts or reading further, try to broaden your knowledge of what is going on at the time. I mean, of course, I would love it if people learn that stuff
Yes, they
from my
should read
book.
your book. Definitely
You know,
buy
I,
it.
there's a lot of research in there. There's really a
Hmm.
lot, because there was a lot I wanted to understand. You know, I kept kind of asking myself questions. Why is it like this? Why does it have to be like this? You know, everyone accepts that it's just part of the age for everything to be terrible, as though it was hardwired. And yeah, some of it's hardwired, but a lot of it isn't. And we have so much more power than we think to make things better for our kids. And we can do that. And schools can do that. I mean, when you talked about concrete things, but it all starts with our own adult self-management.
Mm,
What we're modeling, sort of what we demand, and what our values are, and also what we put into practice, right? So if we really consciously think about what kindness and inclusion are and consist of and look like on a day-to-day level, you know, we don't just say to our kids, be nice, which is utterly meaningless, but we show them that being nice, for example, means that if you're having, I don't know, a sleepover on a Friday back in the day when kids were actually in school,
hmm.
you're inviting a small group and you're leaving some people out, that you don't leave from the playground.
Yeah,
You don't make it really obvious,
yeah.
right? You know, things like that, little things like that, that often we don't even do viciously, and that they don't do viciously, that people around may interpret viciously, but it's just kind of an oversight. Thinking more consciously about that. And I think schools have such a big role to play in educating parents and kids alike, so that they can perceive what they're simply not perceiving, and be more aware of the impact on others, and also give them better ideas
Yeah.
to deal with things.
No, that's such an important point, and I'm really glad you brought up inclusion because with the, slightly older lens of seeing kids come up from, kindergarten through at least ninth grade so far, I do see that some of the kids who were maybe awkward or on the outskirts of the social groups in fourth, fifth, sixth grade later like come out as LGBTQ or, had a learning disability or there was something going on that doubly marginalized them, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of the parents inadvertent support of that exclusion
Yeah.
was really, really painful for some of those kids. So,
Oh, and for their parents, it's agony to see parents who, for example, you once considered your friends, kind of, you know, being part of the inclusion of your kid because they are different in some way, at a point when everybody wants to be the same. And especially, you know, in school cultures or areas that are super normative, where, you know, or in groups of kids. I mean, it can be the
yeah,
same school but vary grade to grade, where everybody has to look a certain way and be a certain way, which is more or less universal as a kind of desire at that age, right? But parents can reinforce it or not. Parents can refer to the kid who's different as weird, you know, or pathologize them, or express admiration for the fact that they are independent spirits who don't care what everyone else is doing, right? Adults do set the tone. Teachers, school administrators, and parents set the tone. And that's on us, frankly. You
yeah.
know, keep fiddling with trying to figure out how to improve our kids. And I just, more and more, I cannot stress enough that it has to start with ourselves.
Yes, love it. And you talk also in the book about the extra layer for kids of color,
Yes.
and what that's like to try to navigate not only the sort of fitting in, but the, am I going to be part of this as a way to survive, or how, what are those choices for kids of color, especially, Black and Indigenous kids who are in majority white communities?
You know, as you say, there are different strategies that kids adopt, that kids of color adopt and adapt. And part of it, I think, has to do with what's available to them for that adaptation. I think of one woman who I interviewed who actually grew up in our area, who went to a, you know, a wealthy, pretty much all white private school. She herself was wealthy and very attractive and athletic and funny. And she was one of the leaders of the popular crowd. And she thinks back on herself as a mean girl and knows that in her case, it was a survival strategy. It was a way to fit in and just sort of like not have to worry about being othered, because she was able to become so much part of it, right? Those aren't the tools that are necessarily, well, for all kids, right? Or for other kids of color who just have to find other, in those situations, find other strategies to sort of keep themselves whole and get through it. And sometimes, there's the ability to look at the social drama playing out and say, that's not me. I mean, that's just not my story, which is kind of an advantage in a way, if you can derive the strength to be able to not have it be your story and not mind. That's really hard. At that age, it's really hard. And, again, as adults, we have to be really conscious about not reinforcing exclusion, not reinforcing bias. I think that in a lot of our communities, we really want to do the right thing, and we often believe that we're doing the right thing, but we inadvertently reinforce what the kids are doing, or
Yeah.
we allow it to take place without really pushing against it, pushing
Yeah.
back actively. And we can do better than that. And I think also we have to realize, and this has been particularly true for the past 4 years, that our kids are hearing a lot of hate speech, and kids that age are constantly trying out different identities and different ways of being, which include picking up different ways of speaking and saying things that maybe they normally wouldn't say, right? Maybe they wouldn't have said when they were younger, they wouldn't have said when they were older, but this is sort of a persona they're taking on. And I think one thing that's important to remember is that we tend to think that if a kid says something, something racist, something horrible, that it's coming from the home. Sometimes it is, but not always.
Hmm.
I mean, sometimes it's actually a rebellion against their home. And we have to intervene. We have to teach them empathy. The schools really have to do that too. And there have to be open and honest conversations. And there has to be a desire to promote greater understanding, greater knowledge, understanding that words matter, especially with kids this age who very, very often their words are almost an abstraction to them, especially if they're in writing in the text, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that, your perspective and seeing kids as forming their identities at this age and trying out different ways of being. And for us as adults, having this very important role to play in helping them find the boundaries of that and maybe reflecting to them, what that might mean in the real world so that they can sort of move on, right, to something else that's more helpful.
It's
Um,
very hard, and I'm speaking here in general, not only in cases of racism, let's say, or other forms of hate speech. If your kid has been hurt, of course, you're going to feel like the other kid is just a really bad person, right? I mean, that's how we react. And that's why educators are helpful, because hopefully, they can have the perspective of seeing it as a teachable moment for everybody, not just the couple of kids involved, but everybody, right? So that you don't just sort of push this under the rug, you bring it out and you make it a moment where people learn about the power of words and about power dynamics generally. Everyone's talking about structural racism now. These kids are not too young to start to learn about things like that. This is exactly the direction that their minds are forming, that their brains are evolving to be able to take on really complex ideas like that. And they want to. That's the other thing with all the negativity that we bring to the age group. We forget that they actually have a very, very strong sense of
yeah.
justice at this age. And they want to have that be engaged with, and
Yeah.
they don't want to be talked down to.
Right, right. And if we don't give them a way to feel that the world is fair, then we're the ones who are unfair and unjust. I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this, right? Helping our kids make sense of this age, helping them question some of their choices or being a reflection and pushing back on some of these things. I wonder if during the pandemic, we maybe have a better opportunity to do some of that because we are now with them all the time, right? And when do we know if we're maybe going a little overboard? It's such a dance with this
It's
age,
such
right?
a dance.
Any advice you have around that or thoughts about the pandemic maybe being an opportunity to pull back a little bit from some of those, in-person interactions that might be hard for them?
Well, it's especially a moment to be able to disrupt some of the kind of physical forms of exclusion that happen. Who's in what carpool, who gets to sit at what table, who's
Hmm.
partnering with who for group work, and physically there, choosing partners, which is something I think shouldn't happen. I think that teachers should consistently assign partners. Frankly, in middle school, I think lunch tables should be assigned too. just to avoid these kinds of problems. But so those things are removed, right? So kids don't have to navigate that all the time in the same way. That's good. That gives an opportunity for a reset. All kids are sleeping more, so that's an opportunity, which at least brings them to kind of a better place physically and mentally. And I think, the problem is we're entering our third season of this, right?
Yeah.
And I think at the beginning, obviously it was hard. There was a lot of anxiety and uncertainty what was going to come, but there also was an opportunity to sort of take a breath. Kids were connecting with friends who maybe they'd lost touch with. They were able to connect to interests that they had gotten distance from, let's say, in middle school when they had to be like everyone else and be cool. And that was good, right? And families were, coming together. And I think there was also a sense of like coming together in the face of utter uncertainty. I'm not saying it was great for everybody. Lots of people, it was wretched from the start.
Yeah.
But at least some people had that feeling of reprieve. And I think the longer it goes on, the more depressing it becomes, frankly. And I think that for kids, the more they have the feeling of like, especially adolescents, which our middle schoolers are, I do not want these people around me all the time. So it becomes that much trickier to be able to be present enough to give them the support that they need, but at the same time not stifle them. And that's always the issue with this age group. And we are just facing it that much more strongly right now.
Yeah.
So I think we have to tread lightly. I think we have to be there without being too in their face so that they can in some way create for themselves the distance from us that they so desperately need at this age. Because if they don't have it, it's a whole, developmental hurdle or, developmental stage that is actually being stymied for them right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because you also write in the book that this age is as our kids go into adolescence, we as parents tend to, the research shows, have this lower feelings of competence, right? That we're not sort of this is a new job for us, like figuring out that dance of like how to be there but not too much. And
Yes.
I'd love to hear. I know in our house we try to use humor a lot. So like one of our lines is, dad's being awkward, and dad says, "Oh, I'm not awkward, and I'm not a little awkward and embarrassing. I'm a lot awkward and embarrassing, right?" So, but I'd love to hear about maybe just for validation for those of us who feel like, wait a minute, I thought I was a good parent, and now there's all
Yeah.
these new challenges. Can you talk about that research and then also the role of compassion and sort of how that plays in?
I mean, research has shown for a couple of decades now that early adolescence is the phase that parents find the most difficult. And it isn't just, because of the idea that their kids stop talking to them, which actually was not the intent of the title. It's the way a lot of people take it, but it was actually about, when everybody stops talking to you.
Right, in a friend group, yeah.
Um, and the reason by and large that it's so especially hard is, or at least one of the main reasons, is that parents who felt, like they kind of knew what they were doing, right? They had kind of figured it out. Things were, they were getting to some kind of point of feeling relatively confident. All of a sudden just don't. Their kids are encountering problems that are way more complex. Very often they're social situations or social dynamics that they themselves in adulthood still haven't really figured out how to handle, and they can't sort of kiss and make it better anymore, right? Like the kind of suffering that comes along from social situations cuts so deep, and the kids don't want our comfort and help, right? Because we're
Yeah,
lame and it just feels not right to them. And I think that now with the pandemic, I mean, not only are parents having to essentially homeschool often enough, although in some districts, not as much, but they have to be absolutely everything. I mean, the
yeah,
kids don't have physical access by and large, to any of the adults who sort of help them get through their day and structure things for them and provide them with outlets like sports or art. Again, it's piece by piece and it's a little different everywhere, right? But that burden on parents of having to be absolutely everything, which is true in this country for parents of very young children,
yeah,
normally isn't for parents of school age children. That's really hard. And so I think that the compassion has to go a whole number of different ways. And it has to start, I mean, I'm going to sound like, you know, a yoga teacher, but it does have to start with compassion toward ourselves,
Yeah.
because this is hard.
Yeah.
You know, if we're having a hard time, it's because it is objectively hard. It's hard for everyone. No one's going to get it right, because there is no right in a sick situation, which is what,
Yeah.
you know, there is no what, you just do the best that you can.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I that resonates with me. And I think I was just talking to my kids about this. So just saying that out loud, like, this is hard. This
Yeah.
is hard to be on Zoom for 5 hours and then have 3 hours of homework. And
Yeah.
there are some days you're just not going to be able to do it.
No,
So like, that's okay. Give yourself a hug, right?
exactly.
And
Exactly. We all have to give ourselves a break at every age, because we are being asked to do things that are unnatural and that are just really hard. And I think, you know, I think that one of the biggest lessons of middle age for me has been that life is hard. And if life is hard, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. You know,
yes,
I think I grew up thinking, without even being aware of it, that life was supposed to be easy.
right.
I was not aware of that. I wasn't told that. But somehow, looking at people around me, that's what I thought. If you were the way you were supposed to be, then things were supposed to be effortless somehow. And it's just not true. And
Yeah.
you know, if we can save another generation of kids, especially kind of perfectionist girls, maybe especially, you know, who put a lot of pressure on themselves, from thinking that it's all supposed to happen and it's all supposed to happen relatively effortlessly, then we're going to do them a huge favor as they get
Yeah.
older in high school, college, and adulthood.
Oh, I love that message. And I think it's so important. Definitely one of the things that I realized in those early years of middle school with my kids was that when I got worried about it and I started to feel like, oh my gosh, maybe they don't have this social friendship anymore. They're not being included. Like, that makes it so much worse.
Yeah.
Because like, not only do I feel a little bit excluded, my mom thinks I'm a loser, right? Not that I ever did, but
No,
like, you
that's
don't
how
want
they
to send them
interpret
that message, right?
it. Right. You don't intend at all to send them that message, right? But that's how they interpret it. That's the problem. They take it in that way, and there really isn't much you can do about it, except try not to dwell on it.
Yeah.
To the extent that you can, try not to even, I would say, think about it if it's not necessary. Certainly, I have a feeling you're like me, and it's easy to start kind of ruminating on things.
Yeah.
And that is the absolute worst thing, because you vibrate it,
Yeah.
and whether or not you mean to be drawing attention to whatever pain, you are, right? And it keeps them from being able to just kind of deal, get over it, and move on. And the
Yeah.
most important thing really is that the ability to move on.
Yeah. No, I love that also in the book, which, that sometimes we hold on to things longer than our kids do, and they've already moved on and their friendship is back to normal. And we're still like, why were they so mean during those 3 weeks or whatever?
And the psychologist Michael Thompson, who I just adore, has that expression, interviewing for pain, right?
Yes.
You see your kid in the old days after school, and say, like, what happened today? What did so and so do? Like, someone who was mean to your kid in the past. And it's like, and it's not even conscious. Again, nobody wants to be doing that, but it's just driven by your own anxiety. You're anxious about X situation. You've been like ruminating on it all day when you're not working, right? Or even it's interrupting you when you're working. So it bursts out of your mouth, and it's like their bubble bursts, right?
Yeah.
At it. And so I just think, again, self-management,
Yeah.
becoming conscious of these things that just don't present themselves to us, right?
Right. No, I love it. So self-compassion for ourselves, awareness that this is hard, this sort of common humanity that we're all going through this,
Yeah.
and just being kind to ourselves combined with education. I think those are great messages. This is a great place to start with the education. So highly recommend everyone get a copy, whether your kids are in middle school or even, I would say, even past it. I think it's still really relevant, and the stories are so compelling and so beautifully written. Judith, you're
Thank
such a
you.
really amazing storyteller. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
I guess I just want to sort of piggyback for a moment on what you just said about it being something you can read even if your kids are past middle
Yeah.
school. For me, it just taught me a lot about social encounters, the way people relate to one another. That has been enormously helpful for me in adulthood, both in dealing with first my older teen and then young adult kids, but also in terms of looking at my own behavior, the effect it has on other people. and why sometimes I feel the way that I do in different social situations. Because a lot of sort of who we are at that age is who we are throughout life, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of unlearning that we can do, or just ways of growing up that we can have that can make life so much more pleasant.
Oh, I love that. That's a great note to end on, is letting go of this old stories that don't serve us and just stepping into adulthood. So thank you again
Thank
for
you.
talking with me about this. This was super fun, and really love having a break in my day to get to see, listen to your wisdom and to.
It was wonderful talking to you and seeing you, and thank you again.
Okay, wonderful.